Fly fishing from a pontoon boat for trout in lakes. Lesson number 4. Trout feeding habits. Things to remember about trout feeding. Some feeding habits that trout do cannot be duplicated using a fly. When trout eat, it will be one of two ways, either selectively or opportunistically. On the day you fish, barometric pressure, the intensity of the sun, or if there's been a full moon the night before, and certain other weather conditions will affect how trout feed. I have observed that trout seem to use certain subsurface feeding techniques when pursuing and catching their prey. Trout are not active over the entire body of water of a lake, but only feed where food lives and moves. I've noticed that stock trout must acclimate to a lake before they begin feeding. After stock trout are put into a lake, it can take about 2 to 3 days before they will begin feeding. It usually takes them that long to survey the lake and find where food can be located. Some feeding habits cannot be duplicated. Grubbing is when a trout uses its tail to stir up the bottom or the side of a weed bed. His tail action is enough to dislodge insects. After sweeping his tail across an area, he will turn around and eat any moving insect that he can see. Picking is when trout move along the side of a weed bed and pick up any insect that they see lodged on the side of the weeds. I've even seen trout lift their tail up and point their body down and pick up damselflies that are crawling across the bottom toward shore. Hatches occur anytime, so they can occur in a lake in the evening or even in the early morning. So trout can be full even before you arrive at the lake to fish for them. Mayflies have a behavioral drift that they use at night and very early in the morning. They will allow the current of the lake to lift them up and move them to another weed bed. Mayflies have a behavioral drift that they use at night or even early in the morning. They will allow the current of the lake to lift them up and move them to another weed bed. They are vulnerable to trout, and trout may eat their fill of them even before you arrive at the lake, and therefore they won't be hungry. Trout will eat one of two ways. A trout's vision is good from 10 to 15 feet underwater. It usually approaches its prey to a point about 2 to 3 feet to evaluate what it is. The fly does not need to be an exact match of the insect, only a reasonable resemblance of the fly. At that point, the trout will either strike the fly or turn away. If a trout is feeding selectively, he will look at all these things first. Number one, he'll look at the size of the fly. For us, that would be the hook size or even the size of the fly that's tied on the shank of a hook. Number two, he'll look at the shape of the fly. He looks to see if the shape of the fly is close to what he's eating. Number three, he'll look at the color of the fly. Is it similar in color to what he's eating? And finally, he'll look at the behavior. Does this fly move in a similar way to what he is eating? Now, if any one of these four conditions is incorrect, he will actually reject the fly. If the trout is feeding opportunistically, his feeding is influenced by number one, the movement of the fly through the water. Number two, he looks at the size of the fly and the color of the fly. In his mind, these would be of equal value. And finally, he would be influenced by sound, the acoustic footprint that the fly makes as it moves through the water. All insects who move through the water have an acoustic footprint. If any of these three things are not correct, the trout will reject your fly. Barometric pressure, the sun, the moon, and other weather conditions all affect how trout feed. Rising and falling barometric pressure during the day affects trout feeding habits. Bright sun can make it difficult for trout to feed, and trout can feed by the light of a full moon. How barometric pressure affects trout. After a cold front passes overhead, trout move deep to feed close to the bottom to stabilize the pressure in their inner ear. Discomfort is caused by the barometric pressure. I am researching barometric pressure to see what other things about it affect trout feeding habits and plan to post a video on this site after I've evaluated the information that I can find. Bright sun can make it difficult to feed. On bright sunny days with wind, the water surface is so rough that trout go deep and can go off the bite because of the glare. Some experts believe that sunlight passing through the broken surface delivers a light show similar to the way a strobe light would affect you in a dark room. After a while, you feel nauseous or even disoriented. They believe that trout feel the same way, as their eyes are very sensitive to subtle light changes. Extreme light movement disorients them. They look for shelter or undisturbed water where they can retreat from this condition. Trout feed by the light of a full moon. Trout can feed by the light of a full moon by seeing the silhouette of the flies as they observe them using Snell's window. This can occur one day before a full moon, the day of a full moon, and 2 days after the full moon, if the nights are clear or partly cloudy. If you arrive the next day, the trout may not be feeding at all. Trout subsurface feeding techniques. Use Snell's window as we learned about in lesson number 1. They feed by underwater movement of aquatic insects in feeding zones, and they feed based on prey behavior. Feeding zone as seen by a fish finder. A fish finder is a wonderful tool that will allow you to determine what the fish may be doing underwater. Some people try to use it to locate fish, and then they try to put the fly into the location they see on the finder. Well, good luck with that. The image that you see on the finder is actually delayed by either 5 or 7 seconds. The time it takes for the signal to go out and back and show the image on the screen. By the time you try to get a fly to the fish, he's already moved on. And there are only a few times that you can actually determine the direction the fish is moving. You might get lucky some of the time, but that's it. You are just lucky. By determining where the fish are underwater, you can see in what zone they're feeding. The finder shows all activity between the surface and the bottom, and you see that there are 3 basic feeding zones that can be observed on the fish finder. The top zone on the left, the middle zone in the middle, and the bottom zone on the right. If you see fish in the top zone, that would be inches below the surface up to about 12 inches. That could be a sign of a hatch about to start or already underway. That could mean that the fish are surface feeding on adults, or it could mean that they are just under the surface feeding on emergers. The top zone can be affected by surface disturbance, like heavy wind or disturbance caused by a bright sun. This will affect how you cast and present your fly. Fishing in the middle zone is about 2 feet down to the middle of the depth you are fishing. This could be prey moving like damselflies that like to swim about 2 to 3 feet below the surface. This could be fish intercepting emergers on their way up to the surface. This could be fish who have found a comfort level and are feeding on anything that passes through the water at that depth. Fishing close to or at the bottom. Fish located flat on the bottom are using Snell's window to target insects above them in the water column. Snell's window is also used to feed by the silhouette of insects close to the surface. In some cases, if they're just above the bottom, they could be resting. But If they're about 12 inches above the bottom, they could be feeding on caddis pupa or even chironomids. Trout feed where food lives and moves. Most experts agree that only 10 to 20% of the water in a lake has productive feeding areas for trout. So much of the lake does not contain the habitat that supports the insects that trout feed on. You can use a fish finder to examine the bottom of the lake to find where the productive areas are located. Scuds, caddis, damselflies, mayflies, dragonflies all search weed beds to find food. Now, you can't imitate this weed bed feeding, but there are some insects that do things that you can imitate with a fly. Mayflies regularly launch upwards from a weed bed using what is called a false rise. They go up to the surface and then slowly settle back down to the weed bed, and they'll continue doing this. They do this so they can get ready for the day that they will hatch. This exposes them to any trout in the area. Caddisflies use behavioral drift in the afternoon or evening to move from one weed bed to another to feed on insects. They allow themselves to drift in the lake's current and make themselves vulnerable to trout. If there are trees located next to the lake that are dropping their leaves into the lake, then caddis pupa and leeches can move and feed in these shoreline leaf beds. Two-year damselflies do shoreline feeding early in the morning, then return to the nearest weed bed for protection. There's a video on this site that explains this called the 24-month damselfly. When a hatch begins from a weed bed to the surface, leeches move into the hatch close to the weed beds to feed. There's a video, My Leech Theory, that tells you a lot more about how trout feed on leeches.